Throughout the Second World War, there were a number of evil Japanese generals who were responsible for many war crimes. At the hands of the Japanese, a number of Australian nurses were executed on a beach by machine gun fire and by soldiers who committed scores of atrocities. Also, they would rampage and cause chaos before the conflict broke out in Europe, within China, and would commit many terrible crimes inside cities such as Nanking. It's believed that the Japanese army were guilty of the executions and killings of 14 million civilians across Asia as they went through different lands, and 2 officers even had a race to see who was the first to execute 100 people with a sword the quickest. But there was one Japanese general named Masao Baba who would at the end of the conflict be executed for his involvement in crimes linked to the Sandakan Death Marches, which resulted in the deaths of over 2,200 Australian prisoners of war. But what is the story of the execution of General Masao Baba? Join us today as we look at this, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Masao Baba was born in January 1892 inside of the Kumamoto Prefecture, and he was the son of a lieutenant who had a long history inside of the Japanese army. Masao would follow in his father's footsteps, and he would attend military schools from childhood, and he then went to Army Cadet School in Hiroshima. The education he was given was based on a Prussian academy and a Prussian style of teaching, and he would graduate from the 24th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in December 1912, when he was 20. He trained and specialised as a cavalry soldier, and then when he was a second lieutenant he became part of the Imperial Japanese Army's 5th Cavalry Regiment. Baba continued to train, and he was part of the 33rd class of the Army War College, and he continued as a cavalry soldier throughout his military career. He even became part of the Inspectorate of the Cavalry, and continual promotions led to him becoming a colonel, and he was then given command of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. But in July 1938, Baba became a Major General, and he served as a commanding officer of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade as the Second World War broke out. He continued to rise throughout the ranks, and he became the Commander-in-Chief of all cavalry operations in the Pacific. He would be assigned to Inner Mongolia to oversee the cavalry operations there, but he then became the commander of the 53rd Division, and he was appointed the commander of the 4th Division in Sumatra. He must have been a very well-respected member of the military, as he was continually given command of different divisions and groups, and with this he then became the Commander-in-Chief of the 37th Army in Borneo. Whilst he was in Borneo, Masao Baba was involved in the anti-guerrilla operations inside of the island, and he would lead soldiers to hunt down guerrilla fighters. However, it was inside of the country where he would be linked to a crime that would result in his execution. The Sandakan Death Marches were a number of forced marches in Borneo, in which prisoners of war were driven from Sandakan to another town. In 1942 and 1943, Australian and British POWs that had been captured at the Battle of Singapore were taken to North Borneo to make a military airstrip, and a number of prisoner of war camps at Sandakan. Prisoners were forced at gunpoint to work, and they were also beaten whilst they were given little food and medical help. The conditions got worse for the prisoners after a number of officers were moved to a different camp. The Japanese further reduced the rations, and they were also forced sick prisoners to work very hard. There were 3 stages of marches, with the first taking place across dense forest, and 470 prisoners were forced to carry baggage and supplies for the Japanese battalions. Most of the prisoners were malnourished and were suffering from serious illness, and the route took 9 days, and the men only had supplies for 4 days. It was said that within days most collapsed en route, or were killed by the Japanese soldiers, and months later only 6 who had embarked on the route survived. A second march took place, and this lasted 26 days, with over 500 prisoners being given even fewer rations. A final march took place with 250 people being left to starve to death on a large march, but most inmates did not survive after walking 50 kilometres. It was said that a number of the Japanese soldiers also suffered from starvation, and they even turned to cannibalism to survive themselves. There had been a rescue operation planned for those who were held at the Sandakan camp. However, this was cancelled due to inaccurate intelligence. Because of the lack of food and the brutal treatment by Japanese forces, there were only 38 prisoners who were left alive. All of those were too weak to do any work, and it was ordered that any survivors should be shot. Masao Baba was linked to this awful treatment, and it was said that over 2,200 Australian prisoners of war died in the terrible Death March. However, after the Second World War had come to an end, any commander or general within the Japanese army who was linked to the area where the death marches took place was convicted of war crimes under the command principle. This is where, as the generals did not step in to stop this sort of behaviour, they were also believed to have been liable for the actions of their soldiers as much as the perpetrators were. This principle was later used in war crimes trials against those men who were linked to crimes at Nanking and the atrocities which were carried out there. In January 1947, years after the Second World War had come to an end, General Masao Baba was arrested and was brought to trial for his involvement in crimes against humanity. He was taken to Raubal for trial, and he was found guilty of his involvement in the Sandakan Death March due to the command principle. Much evidence was heard, and some stated that Baba was aware of the weak conditions of the prisoners and the fact they were suffering. However, he gave direct orders for a second march to take place, showing that there was orders given by Baba that would inflict more suffering and death onto prisoners of war. Because of this, he was sentenced to death and was to be executed following a trial that lasted 8 days. On the 7th of August 1947, Masao Baba was led from his prison cell inside of Raubal in New Guinea, and he was led to where a gallows had been created. He was then led up the execution device, and a rope and cap was placed over his head, and within seconds the executioner released a trapdoor, and he was left hanging. What is interesting is that it's clear that General Masao Baba had a huge disregard for the lives of prisoners of war, but he also had a disregard for his own soldiers' lives at times. When he ordered the death marches, he may have thought that these would take place through easy and flat jungle, which could be traversed, but this would not be the case. Many Japanese soldiers were later found dead, having decided to die by their own hands from trees in the jungle, due to the tough conditions they were forced to go on the march with as well. He was a commanding officer who could not protect his prisoners and his own men, and for this and many other crimes, General Masao Baba was sentenced to death and was executed years after the war came to an end. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.